Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. for the Maoist-Third Worldist Collective. Today, I wanted to talk about something that I have not discussed in this podcast in several years, at least not directly, and that is the philosophy of critical realism and the philosophy of metaReality, which is really a continuation of critical realism. Both of them were developed by the late philosopher from England, from London, Roy Bhaskar. I began considering myself a critical realist as a result of a rather unusual circumstance. I don't think I've mentioned this before. I was on a listserv, an email list, and somebody said, I think you would like studying critical realism. And I had never heard of critical realism. So I decided to look it up, and I found out about Roy Bhaskar's work. What I discovered later is that this guy was not referring to Roy Bhaskar's work. He was referring to something called theological critical realism, which is an entirely different thing. There is no historical relationship between Bhaskarian critical realism and theological critical realism. But I lucked out for a number of reasons. One, I never would have been drawn to theological critical realism. Why? Because theological critical realism is, I'm not sure if I would say right wing, but certainly very conservative. It's dominated by theologians. There are not very many sociologists who are involved in theological critical realism. So by finding Roy Bhaskar's work, rather than theological critical realism, which is actually what this person intended, I lucked out, as I said, and I found the right thing for me. And so critical realism basically transformed my life as a sociologist. Before that time, I was kind of walking around, going from one thing to another. I had developed my own sociological theory called structural dialectics, which was somewhat interesting. But then, when I found Roy Bhaskar's work, I realized that Roy Bhaskar's critical realism and my own structural dialectics were remarkably similar. So I fit right in. So I had a choice. I could either stay with structural dialectics, or I could begin a new journey in critical realism. And I decided for the second option, fortunately. Because critical realism was much more sophisticated than my structural dialectics. There really is not even any comparison between the two. So I'm happy I made that choice. Now, some of you may know what the critical realism of Roy Bhaskar is. Some of you may have listened to or watched my previous podcasts, which were from a number of years ago, right here on YouTube, which dealt with the subject, but I will go into it again. And this time, I will connect critical realism with Maoism-Third Worldism, because that's what I do as a sociologist. To me, those two are integrally connected. When I first became a critical realist, it was at about the same time as I became a Maoist third worldist for the first time. As many of you know, because I've said it before, I eventually left Maoism-Third Worldism, but I did not leave critical realism. I stayed in critical realism despite the fact that I had left Maoism-Third Worldism. Now, back in June I returned to Maoism-Third Worldism. So once again, I've been working on the process of integrating those two things. And with all due humility, I think I'm doing a much better job of it now than I did the first time. So, okay. Let me explain to you what critical realism is, and in particular, what the philosophy of metaReality refers to. The philosophy of metaReality was the final stage of Roy Bhaskar's critical realism before he died. Now, he himself said that this was the conclusion of critical realism, but a lot of intellectuals will commonly say this is the end, and then they will discover something new. So it really wasn't the end. It was the end for then. So had Roy lived past 70, which is kind of young to die, I'm just 3 years from 70 myself now, who knows what he would have done. But what I have tried to do is to take Roy Bhaskar's critical realism and to develop it further than Roy himself did, as well as combining it with Maoism-Third Worldism. So, first, let me explain briefly what is critical realism and what is the philosophy of metaReality, and then we'll talk about how those two can be connected, at least in my view, with Maoism-Third Worldism. Critical realism was developed by Roy Bhaskar as a result of his involvement with Anthony Giddens' structuration theory. Now, Anthony Giddens is a sociologist like me. Anthony Giddens no longer uses structuration theory. He abandoned it. If you have heard of the term the third way, that term comes originally from Anthony Giddens. Anthony Giddens is not on the left. He is certainly far from being a Marxist. Roy was a Marxist. So the fact that Roy was a structuration theorist seems to me to be a bit of a stretch, but I imagine that Roy found some way of connecting those two in his head. At one point, Roy's friend, who just died recently, Margaret Archer, commonly called Maggie, pointed out to Roy that there was a significant difference between Roy's ideas and Anthony Giddens' ideas. And that difference related to the connection between agency and structure. To Anthony Giddens, agency and structure are basically the same. They're part and parcel of the same thing. Giddens did not make much of a distinction between them. Roy did. And Maggie Archer pointed that out to Roy. Once Roy was convinced that Maggie was right, he abandoned structuration theory and began the process of creating his own philosophy of critical realism, which establishes agency and structure as interdependent, but as distinct. So, for example, I am an agent. You are all agents as well. An agent is an actor, somebody who does things. Social structure refers to the rules and guidelines which regulate human social behavior. If we talk about other kinds of social structures, like institutions, for example, then you're getting into the more macro level, like the family, like religion, like education, like government, like the economy. and they provide guidelines which regulate entire societies. So there are different levels of social structure. There are also types of structure which are not social. For example, the structure of the mind. The mind has a structure too. And there is a relationship between agency and the mind as well. As an agent, I think, and my mind responds to it. Is my thinking and my mind identical? No. They're close, they're connected, but even if I never thought of a thing, maybe that's what I do, I would still have a mind. Even if I never had social agency, there would still be social structure. Now, as a sociologist, I am interested in social structure primarily, not mental structure. So I look at social structure as being the set of rules which govern human behavior. And I look at myself as being a participant in society, in various social systems, in various social institutions. And I can ask, what do I do that contributes to the continuity or perhaps to the change in a particular social structure? And as people, we can both individually and collectively transform social structures, meaning social structure is distinct from agency. It's not the same thing, contrary to what Giddens believed, but it exists in a very close relationship. So I have the ability, especially working with others, to say, well, look, we don't like this capitalist system that we're living under. What can we do to change it? Well, as a Maoist third worldist, I can say, well, I can do podcasts. I can engage in anti-fat, which I do. Maybe there are other things other people can do better, and so they do those things. And so collectively, we can work toward the transformation of social structure, both me as an individual and us as a collection of individuals working together toward a common goal. Now, late in his life, beginning in the early 2000s, Roy developed what he said was the final stage of critical realism, and he called it the philosophy of metaReality. Now, I have taken that philosophy and kind of inverted it, but I will leave that for another time to explain exactly how I inverted it. That would be a distraction for me to get into my process of inversion right now. But that inversion, I think, was very significant, and I wish that Roy Bhaskar had done that himself and didn't leave it to other people like me to do. I'm sure that there are a lot of critical realists who don't agree with me and agree with Roy. That's fine. We each have the right to come to our own conclusions. We are all independent beings with our own social agency, our own ability to make our own determinations. Okay, so what is the philosophy of metaReality in brief? The philosophy of metaReality is a continuation of critical realism. Except here, Roy said that reality includes not only physical reality, reality also includes spiritual reality. That just as you and I physically are real, just as the webcam that I'm looking into right now is real, just as the microphone that I'm talking into right now is real. Spirit is real as well. That was a very controversial idea. Roy was a Marxist. Most critical realists were also Marxists. Many of them were really, really angry at Roy for inserting spirituality, the philosophy of metaReality, into critical realism. It was not something that they thought that he should have done. They saw it as being a horrible mistake that had been committed by Roy Bhaskar, and as a result, many of those people literally abandoned critical realism and went in their own direction. And so it has remained. Have there been people who have replaced them? Yes. Have they made up for the number that have left? I don't know, but my own guess would be no. It appears to me that critical realism is not really growing as rapidly as it did when Roy was alive. Roy was a very eccentric man. He was also very charismatic. People who were attracted to critical realism were often people who were attracted to Roy. They liked Roy. And Roy was a very nice guy. He was very likable. I liked him. I never actually met him face to face. I did have a brief email exchange with him, but you can't get to know somebody like that. So regrettably, I did have an opportunity one time to meet him, but the conference he was speaking at was not one that interested me, and so I passed it up. I deeply regret that now because he died soon after that conference. So I never had the chance to meet him face to face. But be that as it may, that's my own life. So to Roy, both the material and the spiritual are real and should be approached as real. And in our actions, through our agency, we have the ability not only to transform physical things, like, for example, I can put a microwave dinner in my microwave and it instantly becomes edible, right? Probably couldn't eat it before, maybe I could, but it wouldn't taste good, or maybe it wouldn't be fresh, or maybe the ingredients wouldn't be processed properly, whatever. But once it is in the microwave and cooks for 60 seconds, 90 seconds, whatever, I can take it out of the microwave and now the food is edible. Well, the same thing is true with us spiritually. My spirit may not be in a very good state, but through agency, by acquiring spiritual virtues, attributes, by becoming more caring of others. And in my view, to be a communist, one needs to care about others. How can one be a communist and not care about the proletariat? How can one be a communist and not care about the subaltern or the fourth world? Maybe you can, but I can't. It makes no sense to me. So to me, the foundation of communism is caring. And the philosophy of metaReality, as developed by Roy, shows us how we can transform ourselves into caring beings. The two terms he used to illustrate that were demi-reality and co-presence. Demi-reality is a state of disunity, a state of separateness, a state of illusion, a condition in which we as human beings are apart from one another. The kinds of connections which should ideally exist between people don't exist. Well, that's the world we live in. We live in a world dominated by demi-reality. For that reason, Roy was very pessimistic about the future. What I would say is that I have taken that pessimism that Roy had about the future and changed it into a pessimism about the first world. Now, did Roy have experiences in the third world? Yes. In fact, Roy developed the initial stages of meta-reality while he was on a journey to India. Roy's father was originally from India. His mother was English, his father was Indian. And so by being in India, by meeting a lot of Indian gurus, by studying, I believe, the philosophy of Aurobindo, Roy Bhaskar began to develop the philosophy of meta-reality. And this philosophy of meta-reality, again, is a philosophy of spiritual transformation. Again, communism is about transformation. Communism is about eliminating alienation. Communism is about eliminating poverty. Those are basically physical conditions. But to Roy, we also need to eliminate separateness, or as Roy sometimes called it, splitting. Splitting. We literally are split off from one another. And Roy's philosophy of meta-reality was intended as a way of remedying or repairing that splitting in such a way that we can create a world, potentially, which would no longer have splits, which would be instead be based upon co-presence, which is the opposite of demi-reality. Co-presence refers to unity, connectedness. So literally they are opposites. They're two sides of the same coin. You flip the coin, you go from demi-reality, alienation, splitting, disunity, to co-presence, unity, and connectedness. And Roy saw that as literally a kind of spiritual transformation, not only a physical or material transformation, but a spiritual transformation. So in effect, what Roy did is he developed a kind of, I guess for lack of a better term, a spiritualized Marxism. Roy was a Marxist. Roy was a fan of the Soviet Union. He was especially a fan of Fidel Castro. He writes about both of them in his books. But he felt that communism, as it had been developed so far, was incomplete because it lacked that spiritual dimension. Okay, now, I have already connected critical realism and meta-reality with Maoism-Third Worldism to a degree. let me take that one step further, and then I will end the podcast for now and pick up with the subject further down the road. I see critical realism and metareality as a methodology for establishing communism. A methodology. In other words, how can we use our agency, a major theme in critical realism, to transform social structure, for example, through conscientization? How can we develop ourselves, both individually and collectively, in such a way that we will be fit to be inhabitants of a world which will be based on spiritual principles? So that's meta-reality. That's the philosophy of meta-reality. The two of them are connected with each other. So to me, critical realism and meta-reality are the methodology for establishing a communist society, which I see as Maoism-Third Worldism. Because, again, as I said, I share Roy's pessimism. But I think Roy's pessimism was perhaps a bit misplaced. The pessimism should have been focused on the first world, because the first world, the center of the capitalist world system, is in the process of dying. The third world is where our hope for the future lies. Then perhaps if we are fortunate in the first world, we may join the third world in a new communist world system. If not, it may just be what we now call the third world on its own. This is Mark, by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.